Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was April 7th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. Let's begin today's document. Today's document is on the second half of folio 161V of the Gratiarum register for Joan's first year as king. This was found by Daniel Girona y Llagostera for his itinerary project. And this is a gigantic register. The Pares digitized page for this register goes to something like 400 images. And this is basically a list of a bunch of grants and, appointments that Joan made during his first year as king. And it's a lot of very businessy documents. And today's document is a good example of, yet again, we've seen a bunch of these where it's all just very boilerplate, and it's very difficult to figure out anything unusual that's going on other than an appointment. I will say one thing, though, about this document, which is that this is for somebody who's called a herald, and we haven't really seen that before, so it seems like Joan is appointing somebody named Johannes de Monte to become a messenger, and the word for messenger is heraldum, so herald. So that's different, and I haven't really seen one of these documents before that is the appointment of a messenger or a herald. All right, so there's a couple things about this document that are noteworthy just in terms of its apparatus. So first of all, the date is on the very last line of the block of text, and that last line of the document starts with the spelled out word for 7, septima, and the horizontal line above the word, it's called a macron in paleography. That macron is in the place of the letter M. And that's really the most common letter that's replaced with a macron, the letter M. So we can see pretty clearly that beginning letter S, and then an E, and then a P. You can see that loop at the top of the P, and then there's a T that connects into the I. So the I is kind of tilted diagonally to the left, and then the letter A is the end of the word, and the M, that is for the abbreviation mark, goes right before the letter A, and we get the word septima. And then after that we have DA and then aprilis, and the abbreviation mark that is above aprilis, above the P there, that mark commonly expands out to an RI or an RE. So oftentimes the word for land, like terre, will have that abbreviation mark, and in that situation it often expands to an ER. So some kind of R is often what is indicated by that diagonal line above the P, and that's another macron. So these are just two differently shaped macrons that I've been discussing here. So that's your little paleography lesson from this document. Something else that is very noteworthy about this document and really stands out as you're looking at the image is that there's been a little rectangular scrap of paper that has been adhered to the left margin and sticks out. And the Latin there, I can read every letter, but there's a question about how it expands, and even once you get a correct expansion, what it means. So I'm pretty sure that the first thing in that little scrap of paper is the letter N. And there's just a ornamentation on the end of that letter N. And then there's a circle above it. And that mark usually means something like an O or something that has to do with an O. So I would say that this means non, as in not. And then we've got the next word, AD, odd. And then we have MADO. And this is what I would usually think of as mandando, so commanded. So something like not commanded from or to, oh gosh, odd. Oh, okay. So to, odd means to. I always get it confused with ob. All right. So not commanded to, or something like not to the command of. All right, and then the second line is one word, regis, and that is genitive, and so that's a possessive. So we could say something like not to the commanding of the king. And I cannot figure out why that message would be appended to the margin of this document, especially because we have a really clear probata at the end of the document. So at the very bottom of the page on the right-hand side, we've got a very typical short probata. Dominus Rex mandavit mihi, and mihi, well, look at that. We've got a diagonal macron that does not indicate an R, but here indicates an IHI. Oh, goodness. And then Pedro, the P with an O above it, Pedro. See, look, right away I find exceptions to the patterns that I've been just saying. That's paleography for you. Okay. Mihi Pedro de Benjore. So that is a scribe that we've seen many times already, writing for Joan, Pere de Benjore. And this is a very straightforward probata. You know, the Lord King commanded me, or gave to me, this document. And so why is it that then we would have the scrap of paper on the left saying non ad mondado regis? I can't figure it out. So hopefully, as I'm continuing to research the chancery procedures of the Archive of the Crown of Aragon, I'll come across some clue, but this seems to be very strange. It's almost like what's been put onto the margin contradicts what's in the probata. I don't think they would do that. I don't think they would cancel a document in that way. If the document was canceled or overridden, I think from what we've seen, they would have some kind of note. They would cross it out dramatically. So this is something more typical, more procedural, and less dramatic than something like a contradiction would be. So we just have to kind of put a pin in this, and hopefully I'll figure it out sometime this year and I can come back to it and then get some answers. All right, the Latin in this document, I put through my process with Gemini and Claude. I've put 6 registers through the agentic AI pipeline designed by OpenClaw. And they are really expensive, and they're also very resource intensive. So basically it's using a lot of data center power to do that. And so I think I might just stick with the 6 that I've done, because those are the ones that I see coming up a lot in the letters that are cited in the secondary literature. Those are the registers that seem to be the ones that are most connected to my research question about Violante and Joan, and to what extent their level of co-rule was reflective of a gender nonconformity. So I'm going to stick with those 6 registers for a while, and this particular register is too businessy to really, in my mind, merit sending through the OpenClaw pipeline. So what I did today is something way less resource intensive with the large language models. I went back to what I was doing as standard practice for most of March, which is to say that I put a screenshot of this document into Gemini, had it produce a transcription, and then I started at the beginning with Claude and put the image of the document into the Claude chat, and then Claude did its own transcription. Then I took what I got from Gemini and pasted that into the chat with Claude, and at stage 2 of the process, Claude reconciles what it sees from Gemini's output and what it did itself. So I was doing this usual process, and then I noticed that Claude was summarizing the document as having something to do with the Navy, and I was really confused. Like, I was looking for Latin words like nautica or something like that, something having to do with the Navy, and I was like, where is it getting this? It doesn't seem to have anything to do with the sea or Navy. And so I just was like, okay, it's picking out some word somewhere, and I guess I'll figure it out at some point. So I had almost finished, I had basically finished the usual process, and I was looking at what Claude had produced in the translation, and it went really into this whole thing about the Navy, and I looked at what it had for the first and second lines, and it was like dramatically different than what's in the document. It was talking about an admiral. I think what happened was that Gemini saw AD very clearly on line 2, kind of 75% along the length of the line right after salutem et delictem. And it just went wild, and it was like, ooh, it's a really clear A, D, and then maybe what comes after that could be an M, and so it just turned it into Admiral. And it did that and just completely overrode whatever kind of text recognition it had performed for the first 3 lines and replaced it with stuff that it had found in documents about admirals and Navy. And so, you know, it snapped out of that by, I think, line 4. But I didn't notice it when I put that into the Claude chat. And so Claude then looked at that and said, oh, well, you know, that other HTR has identified that there's something about an admiral. And so, yeah, this must be about the Navy. And basically ran with that. And so this is a really, really good demonstration of how one little signal can throw off the large language model and lead it to ignore the text recognition mission and instead draw out on its training set to find patterns that seem to match what it thinks the document is now doing. So, how often did that happen in the mass text recognition that was taking place in these pipelines that I had, 6 registers worth of documents go through? That is something that I need to keep a lookout for. Thus far, what I've found is that it doesn't happen very much. I actually haven't found an instance where the end product after the two LLMs have been working together, the end product hasn't been that dramatically off, but I'm on the lookout for it, and I think I'm going to find it sooner rather than later because of exactly the kind of thing that happened as I was working with today's document. All right, there's a couple little Latin mysteries in today's document that I'll just mention. First of all, in line 4, we have the second part of the name of the person who's the subject of this document, the name of the messenger, Johannes de Monte. And then we have dictum Aragon latorem presentium. And then we've got a slash, which can be read kind of like a comma in our kind of modern way of doing grammar. So, dictum Aragon latorem presentium. I'm not quite sure what that means. Something about like the said Aragon, but then latorem is a word that I looked up in my online Latin dictionary, Whitaker's Words, and what comes up is that it's in the accusative and that it is a noun meaning a mover or a proposer of a law. So I cannot figure out how we have something like said Aragon mover, presented mover, and why we're saying the said Aragon. Where is that referring back to? The large language models said that Johannes de Monte is like named Aragon for some reason. They struggled with how to get the meaning out of this phrase, just like I am. Well, actually, they are struggling with it in a different way. And then in the next line, we have Aragon appearing again, and it is after a long compound word, which I think is something like eundem quae. So itself and Aragon, and then really hard paleography after that, because it looks like the letter M, but I think it's nostrum, our Aragon. So I think what the overall sense here is that this person has moved around the province of Aragon and as a messenger, and he's done good work. Oh, yeah. Really very difficult to get the meaning of each phrase, even though I'm pretty confident that I can go with the overall intent of the document as this person is being appointed as an official messenger, and then the last few lines are like, don't mess with him. No injuries to him will be permitted. So, yeah, that's the best I can do with this medieval Latin in this particular document today. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt Cara Companiona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, maybe you are really curious about medieval Latin after hearing all this, well, then I've done my job. Because remember, the motto of the Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document with that weird rectangle of paper pasted onto its left margin, and additional show notes. And listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.